So, Michael Casey on Neuroaesthetics.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak. And let's just jump right in. So, Art, thank you very much for priming everything that I need for the opening of this. So, I'm going to start by talking a bit about neuroaesthetics. And what we see here is a painting that should be well known to all of you. It's kind of hidden. And what you see over the top is a heat map generated by people's gaze. It's a kind of a statistical map of where people look in this painting, and we'll get to that in a bit. But there's things that we can know about how people look at things, how people look at art. But what I want to do is to kind of think about when we measure people looking at things, and maybe we're measuring the brain, maybe we're measuring where they look, maybe we're measuring how they breathe. I want to think about, going to Jeff's point, about drilling down into a kind of more detailed strategy. Right? How do we affect changes programmatically in the way that program managers or politicians might start to think about the integration of arts, humanities into scientific processes? What kind of evidence can we generate that there's actually a difference in the way that we see something because an artist did it and not a scientist doing a graph, right? And so really maybe what I want to do is just open the discussion on these kinds of brain measurements and attention measurements as a way to create evidence for processes of engagement and empathy and resonance, and maybe insight and perhaps, toward action, the kinds of things that we've been talking about. So the field of neuroaesthetics has kind of grown over a couple of decades, and it's starting to become a field. And really, you can't get very far in neuroaesthetics without hearing about Zeki and his work. In fact, Art's book really has about 3/4 of what I'm going to talk about is in one of Art's books, right? Either the book you just mentioned, from the observer's point of view, or Neurocinematics, right, which is a new book as well. But here's an example of some work that was done where they're really looking at observers who are experiencing beauty. And what they notice is there's a particular part of the brain that when you measure its activation compared to when they're not experiencing beauty, lights up, right? This is what you kind of see in traditional neuroimaging experiments. And they can do this from a visual perspective, an auditory perspective, and audio-visual perspective. But they've also looked at moral beauty and mathematical beauty. And they've kind of found always the same thing, that there's a particular part, area A1 of the medial orbitofrontal cortex, which is part of the emotional brain. Sort of activation there is correlated with reported experiences of visual, musical, moral, and mathematical beauty.
Can you define mathematical beauty?
Yes, I know. Isn't that amazing? So what they do in that paper is they have 20 mathematicians. And they basically, ask them to rate aesthetically equations. And so when they, right, so imagine. So beauty can exist in logical sciences as well, right? But what I want to do really, and so going on from this, there's a neuroaesthetics that kind of looks at reward systems. So the idea that when you present images as artistically rendered images versus kind of realistic images, it actually engages a different part of the brain. And what they're saying is that there's a part of the brain that's really recruited as a reward system. So there's kind of, a sense of that it's beneficial, right, to be engaged with this image versus that image. Now, the same image, but one's in a kind of artistic rendering. So they found this kind of thing. So let's think about, what does it mean to have a reward system? And here's another one where when subjects are rating the images as being increased in terms of their aesthetic, moving. These are moving images versus not. It means emotionally moving images versus not. Well, first of all, there's a high degree of subjectivity. Different people rate different images as moving, right? So we can't look at normative studies. You have to sort of look at the individual response. But they found something very interesting. Something called the default mode network is enhanced during the experience of a moving image. What that means is, and it's kind of interesting because in the default mode network is usually studied in resting state where you're not doing anything, right? But here it is, it's enhanced, there's more activation when people are having this experience, right? So coupled with the last slide about reward, and you put this together with default mode network, you start to get this sense of a whole idea of being engaged, personally engaged with an image has a kind of signature in the brain response. That's one of the things that's kind of come out of neuroaesthetics, something that you can detect. But I do want to sort of question a little bit where neuroaesthetics has been, these kinds of contrast studies, because what they tend to do is to localize small regions of the brain that are implicated in some aspect of beauty or engagement with art. And what I want to do is sort of, over the course of the rest of the presentation, talk about how really we need to look more globally at what's going on in the brain. So let's look at the idea of just where we look when we're looking at an image. The image on the left, and this comes from Massaro et al., the image on the left is actually a moving image. So this was an image that had some, it's a static image of something that's moving, right? Someone who's involved in an action. And here's a static image of someone who's just sitting. And you see that we look at it differently. So when there's implied dynamics, we sort of look kind of in where we think the direction of motion is. And when someone is just sitting in a portrait, we look at the hands, we look at the face. So there's a difference in how you look at an image depending on what you think is happening. Which parts of the brain are being engaged directs the gaze. And we can look kind of in other ways than this. We can actually look at a movie and see where people are looking. And here's an example of a study that was done with the movie There Will Be Blood. And this is the map scene. And it's got a kind of classical composition, as you can see. And what you see, the individual circles are where individual people looked, individual subjects. And the size of the circle is how long they looked at it. And we can start to build up a picture of where are people looking and why is their gaze directed there. And what we find actually is that there's a fair degree of, you can make a heat map of where people look. There's a fair degree of agreement where people look. You can predict, given an image, where people are going to look, where their attention is being drawn. I actually had a movie of this. This is a bunch of images from BBC Wildlife Programme, and you can kind of see where people are looking. But it isn't going to run now because it's a PDF and not a PowerPoint. But that's OK, because it means I can move on more quickly. So let's look at now the integration of image, sound, and motion, just sort of thinking bigger picture, get away from just static images and moving images, but look at kind of integration. Here was a study that was done at Dartmouth by a former student of mine, who is now a PhD student of one of my colleagues in the Neuroscience department, Talia Wheatley. And he did this really interesting experiment where he made this program that could generate music, and it had 5 sliders, the rate of the music, how fast the notes were coming, jitter, how evenly spaced the notes are in time, right? Consonance, how pleasing the sound is in a harmonic sense versus how dissonant it is. Step size, how big the interval sizes are. And direction, is it generally going up or is it generally going down? So you can imagine making a piece of music that has these sliders and you hear this melody. But he did the same thing where he mapped these sliders onto an animation of a ball. So it could be jittering around or it could be moving slowly. And here's what they did in the experiment, is that they presented, they had one group of people who would set the sliders to generate music in different emotional states. Make happy music, make sad music. Move the sliders until you think you've made a piece of sad music. Then what they do is take the sad music and play it to another group of people and ask them, what emotion do you think that is? And virtually 100% of them got it correct. But then what they did is they took the same sliders and made an animation of a ball, played it to a different group of subjects and said, what emotion do you think this ball is expressing? And they recovered with almost 100% accuracy the correct emotion. And they did the same thing conversely, starting with the ball moving to music. So this was interesting. It suggests that the underlying dynamics of the emotional state are irrespective of the modality. So it's cross-modal aesthetics going on here. And it's actually cross-cultural. So not just with Dartmouth College students, but they went to Cambodia and went to a remote village and did the same study. Here's the whole village. This is the hut where they did the experiment. And lots of people wanted to be involved. And there were some basic problems here because, you know, these villagers were not used to computers and not used to interacting with button boxes and stuff, right? So there was a little bit of kind of like, we're just dealing with getting them to do the task. But once they did, what they found was that you actually recovered exactly the same emotional states. The music sounded very similar to what people in the West would said it. So there seemed to be a cross-cultural basis for this cross-modal aesthetics, right? What is underlying the perception of an emotional response to a visual or an acoustic signal. So I just want to put that there. There's a YouTube video about this. It's a PBS documentary that tells you all about it. I won't play it for the sake of time. Now what I want to do is go beyond kind of just like this kind of behavioral study and just these contrast-based studies looking at which area of the brain lights up. And let's actually try to look at something that's very new and very exciting in neuroscience. And that's the idea that you can measure whole brain activity with an fMRI machine. And you can kind of mind read or decode what's happening in someone's brain and present that as an image or present it as a sound. And it has something to do with the image or sound they were either seeing or imagining or dreaming. And this has actually been done. So the Gallant Lab at Berkeley did this amazing study in 2011 where the image on the left is the image as presented to a subject in a scanner. The image on the right is that image reconstructed by a computer program that can interpret the brain images collected in the scanner and map them back to the image, right? Without knowing which image it is that they're seeing, right? So what it does is it actually reconstructs the image based on having a model of how each subject responds to images. It's sort of like it knows the kind of trace of the memory of images in their brain, and it uses that to kind of reconstruct images. It's pretty striking. They do this, and these are actually all videos. They're moving images, and you can see that a lot of the dynamics and the color and the shape are reconstructed. It's not perfect, but it's tantalizing. This was also done with speech in a kind of follow-up paper in January 2012 that, using a different technology, puts grids, electrode grid on the surface of the brain. So this is people who are in neurosurgery. Thank you. 209, right? Yeah. What you get here is the idea that you can actually decode sound, which is the speech that they were being presented with. And we have a project right now where we're trying to decode sound from the imagination. So not just what people are hearing, but what they're thinking. And we've got a certain distance in being able to do this with imagined melodies. Imagine if you could do that for the inner voice. What's We did the same thing for music, and this is a study that I did with Talia Wheatley and others, and we were able to find, for different music genres, we were able to find a spread pattern of activation across the whole brain that identified what kind of music you were listening to. Even if the model didn't know about the specific piece of music, it knew that it was rock and roll, or country music, or heavy metal, or so we kind of can get some idea about, because, you know, music with a beat's probably going to engage the motor areas, right? And so this, you know, kind of things like that.
Is that from imagination or from listening?
We did both. So in this study, it was from listening. And in a more recent study, we're looking at imagination. Yeah.
In the turning the neural signal into a waveform, did you use a similar process as what Nina Kraus has been working with, if you know?
Yeah, I know Nina very well. Yeah, and it's different. We're doing this whole brain regression modeling, and it's about decoding the overlapping and spread activation of neural population as it's changing over time in an fMRI signal, doing regression to a complex acoustic signal, the features of a complex acoustic signal that we then have to invert. So it's a lot of signal processing. Yes, so this is what this work is from the Haxby Lab at Dartmouth. So you can take people watching a movie, And imagine you have 20 different people watching a whole movie, hour and a half, and you have the brain response. Every 1 second, you get the whole brain which response lighting up. And what they were able to do is to actually map everyone's watching of this movie in brain space onto a kind of common brain. But it's different than anatomical alignment. It wasn't they were just aligning the kind of broad kind of anatomical parts of the brain. Because if you did that, here's a classification accuracy that says, if I give you a brain image, can you tell me which part of the movie I was watching? If you do it anatomically, the only accuracy you get is very low accuracy in the visual cortex. That's what this is. But if you do it in this kind of more information space, which is to take the pattern of activation and make it look as similar as possible across subjects, so you're in a kind of more information space than just a neural anatomical space, they actually then can decode accurately which part of a film you're looking at, more or less across the whole brain, which is kind of amazing. So, and then people have been doing it for what I call storyfication, where this is people reading Harry Potter, and you can do the same thing, where you can kind of tell which part of the story that they're reading just by looking at sequence of brain images. And you can do this between subjects as well. And it must be because there are really coarse signatures of what's going on in the story. Oh, this is the bit when the protagonist, the hero has come in to save the day, right? And so there's some kind of trace of that in a whole brain reading. So I see that these kinds of studies, which kind of look more holistically at the brain and try to really understand some of what's actually being coded by neural populations, really can kind of take us beyond just contrast studies of looking at, well, okay, this piece of the brain lights up when you're experiencing beauty. But what does that really mean? Can we decode aspects of what it means to be engaged or to be beautiful or having an aesthetics experience? So that would be a goal. So anyway, I'll leave it there. This is what we hope we would be able to do with neuroscience, is to maybe create some base of evidence that perhaps for people who need such evidence because they're not yet convinced by artistic experience, in and of itself, this is what they need. Yeah.
So Mike, I just had a question about the hyperlinking, the hyper alignment. So were there ever in the studies outliers? I mean, so cases that didn't all line up?
Yeah.
And what does that teach us?
That's a great question, yeah. Yeah, so the way these studies work is you report an accuracy over, let's say you have 20 subjects. You hold one out. You train a model that does all the hyperalignment, makes a kind of reference model. And then you rotate the held out subject in and you see how well you do, right? It was held out of the model, you rotate, and you do that for all 20. Then you average across everything and you get like 60% accuracy or something. But what you're suggesting is now you go in and look at where it didn't work. What about the other 40%, right? And why isn't it working? Well, those are the individual differences, right? And they'd be really important to look at. There's no framework yet for understanding those.
Well, it kind of links back to the last thing of knowledge and perception and what you brought into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Memory.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are things that are missing from these models, right? The whole subjective personal experience of the viewer needs to be accounted for. Yeah.
I'll talk more with you offline, but I think it's worth mentioning for the group. One potential area of opportunity here is in healing.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a program with Department of Defense where we're in this lab for PTSD, TBI. They have a MEG, which we're trying to figure out how do we use for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They have put the arts interventions from as they explain it, from the fringe into the very core of what they're doing, because these are visible existential spiritual wounds, and it makes them visible, and they're able to talk about it, and they're able to talk about it to their speech therapist, to their psychiatrist. It becomes like the core thing. And we are trying very hard to figure out how do we measure what is the impact. And it's really hard because in the scientific method where you want to isolate it out so that you're not allowing the data to be corrupted by something that happened in the psychiatry, that just turns everything in your head because you're synthesizing everything. It's sort of, our lit review goes back to Aristotle, catharsis bringing intellectual clarity from emotional chaos. And that involves your conversations with everybody that's trying to help you with this. So if you're trying to isolate the art out from that,
Right.
it's kind of like,
Yeah.
it's like taking the
Right.
spark plug away from the gas
Right.
to see what really drove the car.
That's why I put, maybe this could be evidence for
Yeah.
a specific mechanism.
Yeah.
That's the idea, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you see any kind of comparative studies being done with current modes of expression versus more artistic modes of expression?
Not so much here
Yeah.
in this kind of neuroscience work, but certainly in evaluative work for visualization, for example, there's been a little bit of that, yeah. But it needs to move into this space, I think, yeah.
It would seem that the PTSD applications are immense for understanding, how the brain is currently functioning, what modes might change the brain's functioning based on stimuli, and the calming of the brain, possibly, those effects of music and calming or visual arts and calming.
And there's, and I don't want to take this off, but it does really fit this. We took, there's arts therapy mask making that was on the front of National Geographic in February, and that's like a visualization of something that they couldn't explain to anybody for 10 years. They're usually people who have been confronting this for a while and have not gotten anywhere. And it is really stark. They come in for 4 weeks and they leave, transformed. We wanted to bring in writing because expressive writing, which is really more of a psychology-based research, James Pennebaker, I don't know if anybody, but they looked at it as exposure-based therapy, habituation, and we wanted to bring in meaning-making and catharsis. And there's a learning aspect. There's the aha, that then allows them to, okay, now I get it, and now I can, move on.
I only had one more slide, and really, after having dinner last night, I was sitting next to Art, and I thought I really had to put that in.
That's great. Okay, so I know there's lots of other questions and comments. We'll hold